In this video, we're going to talk about community ecology, which is a branch of biology that studies the interaction between members of different populations. Populations don't exist in isolation. Within an ecosystem, different populations of different species interact with one another. So community ecology asks, what kind of relationships are there between members of different populations, and how does this relationship affect each of those interacting populations? Foundation species, just like the name implies, form the foundation of a community of different populations that live with each other in a particular area. So that's the base or bedrock of the community. And if you get rid of them, you basically impact the entire community, entire different populations that live in that community. So what are some examples? Well, coral reefs are the foundation of an entire ecosystem. There is so much biological diversity in so many different types of organisms that live in coral reefs, take advantage of the structure of the coral reefs. And it is not only limited to the aquatic organisms that live in the coral reefs. Human beings also depend a lot. In a large part of the world, human beings depend on the fish that they take from these coral reefs. So coral reefs play a very important role in the survival of many species, including us. And unfortunately, climate change is decimating a large number of them. Another example of foundation species are kelp, which is basically the foundation for the kelp forests that we see off the coast of California. Keystone species are organisms which their presence or absence really heavily impacts the composition of the community. An example of such a keystone species is the sea star that you see in this picture. When this sea star is absent, all of a sudden a mussel population numbers drastically increase and completely changes the composition of the ecosystem. So it's very important to be careful as to what effect we can have on a community when we remove or destroy a particular organism. So, for example, if you hear, well, the starfish are dying in such and such part of the world, and say, so what? Who cares? They're just starfish, but not realizing that they are keystone species. Their absence is probably going to mean abundance of something that the ecosystem cannot handle. There are also those who have negative effects on other members of the community, and these are invasive species. These are species that, relative to other species in the community, can grow really fast and take over a particular area and take away resources from other populations that live there. And these are examples of invasive species of plants that you may see in San Diego. So the yellow flowers that you see that grow like the tall on the tip of a tall weed. We see them everywhere. That's although they may be pretty there, but they're actually invasive. The Mexican fan palm, and also these ground covers called ice plant, they are also invasive species. Now, other types of interaction that members of a community have are predator-prey interaction and herbivory. And herbivory basically is a kind of a predator-prey interaction that involves plants. So it's one organism that feeds on a plant. And this type of interaction is actually a driver of evolutionary adaptation. And you can see these evolutionary adaptations here. So with terms of in terms of plants, you can see the reason some plants grow thorns is because that's a mechanical defense for these plants, and it protects them against herbivores. The red-bellied turtle that you see, its shell, it's mechanical defense system again. So it can just go and hide in its shell when things get rough. The foxglove plant has a chemical defense, which is a toxin that is produced by the plant that causes nausea, vomiting, hallucinations, and maybe death. So that it's a good deterrent for an organism that wants to feed on this plant. And the North American millipede uses both mechanical and chemical defenses. So when it's threatened, it curls into a defensive ball and then produces a really bad substance that irritates the eyes and skin. Then we have the strawberry poison dart, which has a really bright red color, which it's basically a flag telling the predators, hey, be careful, I've got poison, you're gonna die if you eat me. And then the stripe at the back of the skunk is another coloration pattern that warns the predators that if you get close, I'll spray you with a bad odor. Now, another clever adaptation is mimicry. So basically, organisms that either, if they are eaten, they kill the predator or really make them sick or give them a really bad taste. They have specific colorations and patterns. And then there are other types of organisms, let's say these butterflies, that they don't have those properties, but their defense is copying the coloration pattern of the members of the population that are actually poisonous or bad tasting. And you can see this in this population of butterflies. So some of the species of these butterflies are bad tasting, and they have specific coloration patterns as a warning to predators, but there are also those of them which are not bad tasting, but their coloration pattern is identical or pretty similar to the ones that warn the predators that are bad tasting, and predators know how to avoid them. So another type of interaction between members of the community is competition. And the reason it's called interspecific competition is because it's competition in between. Inter means in between different populations. And sometimes when competition gets really, really bad, and when the niches and the needs of two different populations get so close and they overlap so much, it actually has drastic consequences for some of the populations that are involved in the interaction. So here's an example of two different populations of paramecium. If you grow them on their own in panel A and B, you can see that they can grow in the logistic pattern, but if you actually put them both into the same test tube, one of them wins out because they need exactly the same kind of material as the other population to grow, so one of them loses. And we see this competitive exclusion all the time with us human beings excluding other organisms to survive in the environment that we both share. If you just take a look at all the construction that has been going on, every time we flatten a surface and build thousands of homes, the animals and plants that used to be there basically lose out due to competitive exclusion. So another type of relationship is symbiotic. That's basically two different populations living together in close association over a long period of time, which usually can have different consequences for the populations involved. And symbiosis can take different forms with different consequences. So let's take a look at what they are. One type of symbiosis is commensalism, when one population benefits and the other one doesn't really care. So in this case, this bird is building a nest on this tree. That tree basically forms the basis of its home, but that really doesn't change anything for the tree. So that's commensalism. Mutualism is when the two populations that are interacting, they both benefit from the interaction. Termites, actually, the reason that they can chew cellulose, the wood that they chew, it's because they have these little microbes, these protozoans that live in their gut. So the termites bring food for the protozoans, and then the protozoans help the termites to digest that food. So it's a win-win situation. We have the same kind of relationship with the microbes that live in our gut. Another example is the relationship in lichen. Lichen is a fungus that interacts with algae that is living inside of it. So basically, the fungus forms a structure in which the algae can live. The fungus gets its source of food is the algae due to photosynthesis, but it also the fungus can break down large macromolecules and can provide algae with the basic starting ingredients to build that food using photosynthesis. So this is a win-win situation. With parasitism, it's kind of a relationship with one loses out and the other one wins. And this is an example of a tapeworm that lives inside a human being. It can make that human being really, really sick, but during that process, the tapeworm can reproduce itself and survive. So communities either are formed from scratch over long periods of time, or sometimes communities that already exist can suffer a disturbance, a real disaster, but they can come back from it and form the community again. And this process is called succession. Succession is sequential appearance, a disappearance of species in a community over time. So primary succession is a situation when you build the community from scratch, when you have a situation that there was no community in a particular area before. So therefore, in a primary succession, a newly exposed or newly formed rock is colonized by living organisms. So that's one example. So this is a community that is built from a place where there were no life existing before. Secondary succession is when a community existed, but it underwent a disturbance, but the disturbance was not so drastic, such that life had to build itself from scratch. This is secondary succession is when an ecosystem is disturbed, but there are remnants of the previous communities that remain, which nature can build on. So an example of primary succession is when there is a volcanic eruption, and the volcanic eruption, the lava comes out, and it's really, really hot. It's so hot that nothing really can live there. But as the lava touches the ground and then goes into the ocean, it cools down, it forms rocks. Now that rock is bare. There is no sign of a community that lived there before. But over time, that rock can build a community of life there. So what can happen is that birds and animals can move in there, and then seeds and pollen can travel through wind. Fungus can grow there by digging into the lava and breaking down the complex molecules. So life starts growing in a bare rock that didn't exist before, or rock that is exposed after being covered by a glacier for millions of years. That's called primary succession. Secondary succession is when, again, life builds itself after suffering a setback. And this succession, the reason they call it succession, because it happens in stages. First you get small shrubs, then you get larger plants to grow, and then the entire composition of the community changes over time. If you ever visit a space in San Diego where there was a wildfire and all the plants were wiped off, in the beginning you can see smaller plants growing up from under the rock, but if you keep observing that space over time, you will see that the composition of the community changes, the type of plants that change, until you get to a place where it's called climax community, where the kind of composition of the community becomes stabilized. Now again, we have a couple of practice questions for you.